What would you do if your boss slapped an intern in the middle of the office lobby, only to realize, too late, that the intern was actually the CEO? Ethan Carter had always believed in keeping a low profile. Unlike the power-hungry executives who strutted around their companies, demanding recognition and deference, he preferred to stay unnoticed. He had built his empire from the ground up, turning his consulting firm into one of the most respected in the country. At 35, he had no interest in running things from an ivory tower. He didn't need his employees to fear him or fake admiration. What he valued was the truth, unfiltered and unpolished. And the best way to get it was to walk among his people unseen. Returning to headquarters after months of high-stakes negotiations overseas, Ethan sensed subtle but undeniable shifts in the company's atmosphere. Something had changed in his absence. Whispers in the hallways. A tension that hadn't been there before. He knew from experience that power, when left unchecked, had a way of rotting from the inside. That's why he was here, to see things for himself before problems spiraled beyond control. The most significant restructuring had happened in the contracts department. A new department head, Karen Welch, had been appointed, and on paper, her credentials were solid. The HR reports showed no immediate red flags, but instinct told him otherwise. Experience had taught Ethan that some people knew how to hide poison behind a polished resume. Dressed in a fitted button-down, dark jeans, and a jacket that made him look like any mid-level employee, Ethan entered the sleek, modern lobby of his own company. Employees bustled around him, phones rang, conversations layered over each other like white noise. No one recognized him, that was exactly how he wanted it. But before he could take another step, a sharp, cutting voice sliced through the air. "You. Yes, you. Standing there like you have all the time in the world, do you have nothing better to do?" The voice was laced with impatience, dripping with entitlement. Ethan turned his head slightly, catching sight of a woman storming across the lobby with the kind of authority that wasn't earned, it was imposed. She was in her 40s, blonde hair styled into a razor-sharp bob, her tailored blazer and pencil skirt immaculate. But it wasn't her appearance that caught his attention. It was her tone. Karen Welch. The name clicked instantly. The woman in charge of contracts. The one he had come here to observe. "Are you deaf or just slow?" she snapped, closing the distance between them, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "I asked if you have nothing better to do." Ethan raised an eyebrow, keeping his face carefully neutral. "Excuse me?" Karen exhaled in exasperation. "God, interns get lazier every year. I need someone to run these documents to legal, and since you're standing around doing nothing, congratulations, you just volunteered." She shoved a thick folder toward him, fully expecting him to take it without question. Ethan didn't move. "I think you might be mistaking me for someone else," he said, his voice calm. Karen's expression darkened. "Oh, for God's sake, don't tell me you're one of those fragile types who needs their hand held for every little task. This isn't complicated, take the folder, walk to the legal department, drop it off." "Why is that so hard?" Ethan let the silence stretch between them, watching her carefully. He had been mistaken for an intern before, and normally, he wouldn't have cared. Titles meant nothing to him. But this wasn't about a misunderstanding. This was about her tone, the sheer condescension, the entitlement. Her absolute certainty that she could treat people like this and get away with it. And then she did something that made the entire lobby freeze. She slapped him. It wasn't a full-force hit meant to injure, more like a sharp, dismissive smack, the kind meant to humiliate rather than harm. But it was loud enough to echo through the room, loud enough that conversation stopped mid-sentence as heads turned in stunned disbelief. Ethan barely moved. His jaw tightened for half a second, but otherwise, his expression remained unreadable. Karen, on the other hand, tilted her chin upward, waiting for some kind of reaction, maybe fear, maybe submission. Instead, Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice cool and measured. "I'm going to give you a piece of advice," he said, his tone even. "You might want to be very, very sure of who you're talking to before you put your hands on them." Something flickered in her eyes, just for a moment, before arrogance buried it again. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "What are you going to do? Run to HR? Complain to someone higher up?" A slow smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth. But there was no warmth in it. "Something like that." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing there, still clutching the folder, her face frozen in confusion. Behind him, the murmurs started, employees whispering, stealing glances at Karen, their expressions shifting from stunned disbelief to something darker. She had no idea who she had just slapped. But soon enough, she was going to find out. Ethan Carter walked toward the elevators, his pace unhurried, his expression calm, but beneath the surface, his mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. He had been prepared to find inefficiencies, maybe a few questionable management choices, but what he had just witnessed, that was something else entirely. Karen Welch wasn't just an abrasive leader, she was dangerous, and if she was willing to humiliate and physically strike someone she assumed was an intern, it raised a much bigger question. How had she been treating her actual employees? As the elevator doors slid shut, the hum of conversation from the lobby faded behind him, replaced by the quiet hum of the executive floors above. Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed a direct number. The voice on the other end picked up almost immediately. "I need you to pull up the full employment file on Karen Welch," Ethan said, his voice measured. "Everything. And while you're at it, I need a list of complaints, formal or informal, filed against her since she started." The briefest hesitation came from the other end before a professional but cautious reply. "Understood. I'll have the file sent to you within the hour." Ethan ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket as the elevator arrived at his floor. This wasn't the first time he had encountered a toxic manager, but something about Karen felt different. There was an entitlement to her cruelty, a confidence that suggested she had never faced real consequences. And that was about to change. Less than an hour later, his inbox lit up. He opened the file, scanning the contents with sharp precision. On paper, Karen was impeccable, **** elite education, years of high-profile experience, glowing recommendations, **** too perfect. Fabricated, his gut told him as much, but the real problem wasn't in her resume. It was buried in the internal records. 3 formal complaints. One from a junior analyst, *** Lauren Hayes ***, who had questioned why certain contracts were pushed through without the proper approvals. She had been publicly berated, written up for insubordination, and nearly fired. The second came from a senior manager who had quietly tried to resign after clashing with Karen over ethical concerns. Karen had made veiled threats about his job security, insinuating that his family's health benefits might be re-evaluated if he walked away. But it was the third complaint that sent a sharp chill through Ethan's veins. It was anonymous, but the accusations were far more serious. Verbal abuse, threats, intimidation, and financial manipulation. The complainant had hinted that Karen had been falsifying contract details to benefit an external vendor, a vendor that, on paper, didn't exist. And yet, all 3 complaints had been dismissed. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just a bad hire. This was a systematic cover-up. Someone had been protecting Karen. Someone high enough in the company to bury legitimate concerns before they could escalate. He didn't waste time. He called Tom Calloway, head of corporate security, a man who had been with Ethan since the company's earliest days. Tom was thorough, meticulous, and completely unshakable. If something had been overlooked, he would find it. "I need a discreet review of Karen Welch's activities since she started here," Ethan instructed when Tom stepped into his office minutes later. "Something isn't adding up." Tom didn't ask why. He simply nodded once. Financials, personnel records, external connections? All of the above. By the time Tom left, Ethan had already turned his attention to the next phase. If Karen was manipulating financial records, then someone in accounting had to be helping her. He dialed another number, **** Dan Whitaker, his CFO, ****. Dan answered on the second ring. "Ethan. What's going on?" "I need you to do something for me," Ethan said evenly, skipping past the pleasantries. "No alerts, no red flags. I need a forensic audit of every contract Karen Welch has touched since she started. Look for unusual vendor activity, unverified accounts, anything that doesn't follow standard protocol." A pause. Then Dan exhaled through his nose. "That's a hell of a request." "You'll see why soon enough," Ethan said. "Start at the beginning of her employment. I want everything." "Understood. Give me a few hours." By the time Ethan ended the call, he already had the shape of the truth forming in his mind. Karen wasn't just intimidating employees and crushing dissent. She was stealing. And she was arrogant enough to believe no one would catch her. Hours later, Dan's report landed in Ethan's inbox. He opened the file, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the data. Millions of dollars funneled into shell companies, fraudulent vendors with no verifiable business history. Payments staggered just enough to stay under the radar but, when combined, painted a picture of a slow, deliberate siphoning of company funds. It was textbook financial fraud. And worse, someone had been approving the payments. Greg Stanton, VP of Finance. Ethan exhaled, running a hand down his face. Now it made sense. Greg had the power to override financial checks. If Karen was the knife, Greg was the hand guiding it. Before Ethan could even reach for his phone, a sharp knock on his office door interrupted him. Tom stepped inside, carrying a thick folder. His expression was unreadable, but there was a weight in his stance that told Ethan what he already suspected. "You were right to look into her," Tom said, setting the file down on the desk. "Karen Welch isn't who she says she is." Ethan flipped open the folder, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Karen's entire employment history was a carefully constructed lie. Companies she claimed to have worked for? No record of her glowing recommendations? Fabricated. Even her university credentials had discrepancies, small, barely noticeable details that suggested forgery. And then, the final piece of evidence fell into place. Karen had been authorizing contracts with external vendors. Vendors with no legitimate operations. The money had been moving, siphoned into offshore accounts before disappearing entirely, She had been stealing from the company since day one. And she had never expected to be caught. Ethan sat back, fingers steepled together, his mind calculating the next move. Karen had spent months believing she was untouchable, believing that fear and intimidation were enough to keep people silent. She was about to learn how wrong she had been. Ethan Carter didn't rush. He had learned long ago that the most effective way to dismantle someone wasn't with immediate confrontation but with methodical precision. Karen had built a fortress of intimidation around herself, but fortresses had weak points, and he had just found hers. She thought she was in control. She thought no one would dare challenge her. That illusion was about to shatter. Ethan moved first with silence. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't storm into Karen's office. Instead, he cut off her power, quietly and completely. Within minutes, her system credentials were revoked. Karen, sitting smugly in her office, wouldn't realize anything was wrong at first. She would try to access financial reports, only to find herself locked out. She would try to make a call, only to discover her internal phone line was deactivated. Then the real panic would set in. Ethan didn't stop there. He had his security team monitor her movements. He wanted to see what Karen did when she realized the walls were closing in. Would she run? Would she try to hide evidence? Or, most predictably, would she lash out? It took less than an hour before the first sign of desperation appeared. Karen stormed down to IT, demanding access to her accounts. The technicians, already briefed, pretended it was a system glitch, promising to escalate it to upper management. The delay only frustrated her further. The real test came when she tried to get Greg Stanton on the phone. Ethan had anticipated this. Greg, unaware that Ethan had already connected him to the fraud, had been instructed to play along. "I don't know what's going on, Karen," Greg said, his voice carefully neutral. "It might be an IT issue, but let's not make a scene." "Make a scene?" Karen hissed through clenched teeth. "They've locked me out, Greg. This isn't an accident. Someone is pulling something behind my back." Greg feigned confusion, playing his role perfectly. "Karen, But before he could finish, Karen hung up on him. She was finally realizing she wasn't untouchable. Her next move was predictable. She tried to fight back. But instead of scrambling for an escape, she did what people like her always did when their power was threatened. She went on the offensive. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Karen fabricated an anonymous HR complaint against Ethan. The allegations were laughable, claims of workplace harassment, of financial misconduct. She had no proof, but proof wasn't the point. She was trying to create doubt. She had seen how powerful Ethan was, how effortlessly he commanded the company. And so, in her arrogance, she believed she could turn the tables on him. Ethan expected it. Before HR even forwarded the complaint to him, he was already watching the next phase of her unraveling play out in real time. Because Karen wasn't just stopping at HR. She was trying to frame him for her own crimes. She had gone into her office, locked the door, and sent manipulated financial documents to select board members, suggesting that Ethan himself had been involved in fraudulent transactions. But Karen made one critical mistake. She still trusted Greg Stanton. And Greg was no longer on her side. By the time Karen was weaving her desperate narrative, Greg was already flipping on her. Ethan had given him a choice: go down with Karen or cut a deal. And Greg, ever the self-serving opportunist, chose self-preservation. He handed over everything. Every forged signature. Every override code he had used to authorize Karen's illegal contracts. Every back-channel message that showed she had been funneling money into fake vendors. It was enough to ensure that when the final hammer dropped, Karen wouldn't just be fired, she would be erased. And yet, even as she sensed the walls closing in, she still thought she could escape. The next morning, security footage showed Karen booking a private flight out of the country. She wasn't planning to fight the allegations. She was planning to run. Ethan sat in his office, watching the surveillance feed as Karen exited the parking garage, unaware that every bank account linked to her fraudulent transactions had already been frozen. Her exit plan had failed before it even began. And in less than an hour, she would know it. Karen Welch had always believed she was too smart to fail. That no one would dare challenge her authority. That she could talk or intimidate her way out of any situation. But standing in her office now, watching her computer screen flash access denied for the 10th time, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Panic. She had tried every workaround she knew, logging in from a secondary account, using an old authorization code, even calling IT directly, but nothing worked. And worse, people were watching her. The employees who once avoided eye contact now stole quick, knowing glances. She could feel them whispering. They knew. Her hands curled into fists as she stormed to the door, nearly colliding with her assistant. "Get Greg Stanton on the phone," she snapped. "Now." The assistant swallowed nervously. Greg isn't taking calls." Karen narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me? He, resigned this morning." The words hit her like a slap. Greg wouldn't have left voluntarily. Not without telling her. Not without some sort of plan. Unless. Her pulse spiked. Unless Greg had flipped. Unless she was on her own. No. No, that wasn't possible. She had contingencies. She had leverage. She stormed toward the executive wing, heels clicking against the tile in sharp, furious beats. Employees moved out of her way. Not out of respect, out of fear. She didn't bother knocking when she reached Ethan Carter's office. She shoved the door open, barely registering the assistant's protest behind her. Ethan was seated at his desk, calm, collected, as if he had been expecting her. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice razor-sharp. "Why am I locked out of the system? Why is my authority being questioned?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He took his time closing the file he had been reviewing, lacing his fingers together as he finally met her glare. "Good afternoon, Karen," he said evenly. She felt heat rise in her face. "Cut the act. You think you can pull this behind my back? You think I don't see what you're doing?" Ethan exhaled softly, leaning back. "Karen," he said, almost conversationally. "Do you know what the biggest mistake people make when they try to steal from companies like mine?" Her jaw tensed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "They assume no one is watching," he continued, ignoring her interruption. "They assume the people beneath them are too afraid to speak up. That the money they're moving will go unnoticed. That their access won't raise red flags. That the person in charge is too far removed to ever pay attention." Karen's stomach clenched. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You have no proof of anything. If you don't reinstate my access immediately." Ethan slid a folder across the desk. She stared at it. "Go ahead," he said. "Open it." Karen hesitated, but she couldn't not look. She yanked the folder open, her eyes scanning the first few pages. And her blood ran cold. It was all there. Every unauthorized contract. Every fraudulent vendor. Every financial transaction she thought had been buried beneath layers of misdirection. Even Greg's signed statement, detailing his role in the scheme, and hers. She sucked in a breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the folder. This is fabricated. You can't prove." Ethan tilted his head slightly, watching her with almost clinical detachment. "Karen, we've already shut down every single account tied to your transactions. You have no access. No leverage. And now, you have a decision to make." She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry. "Security is waiting outside," he continued. "They'll escort you out of the building. You won't be coming back." Karen felt like the room was closing in on her. You can't do this," she sputtered, grasping at the last fragments of control. "You have no right." "Oh, and Karen?" Ethan's voice was almost amused now. "Slapping an intern might get you fired. Slapping the CEO? That's just embarrassing." Karen's face twisted in fury, but she had no words left. She turned sharply and stormed out. The moment she stepped into the hallway, every eye was on her. The same employees she had bullied. The same people she had humiliated. And not a single one of them looked sorry to see her go. As security flanked her on both sides, leading her to the exit, she felt her carefully constructed world crumble beneath her feet. But she wasn't finished yet. She still had one card left to play. Karen Welch didn't go quietly. Within 24 hours of her humiliating exit, the first legal threat landed on Ethan Carter's desk, a wrongful termination lawsuit. The accusations were predictable. Retaliation. Discrimination. A hostile work environment. She claimed she had been punished for exposing financial misconduct within the company, twisting the narrative into a desperate attempt to paint herself as the victim. But Karen had never understood one simple truth: lies don't hold up when the facts are undeniable. Ethan didn't bother responding personally. His legal team, led by Michelle Langford, dissected Karen's claims with surgical precision. Every fraudulent contract, every manipulated record, every witness statement detailing her abuse of power was laid bare. By the time Michelle was finished, Karen's case wasn't just weak, it was laughable. The lawsuit was dismissed before it ever reached a courtroom. But Karen wasn't done. Days later, an anonymous article surfaced in the media, claiming that a former high-ranking executive had been forced out after uncovering a massive fraud operation. No names were mentioned, but the implication was clear. Karen had tried to flip the story, painting herself as a whistleblower instead of a thief. She thought that if she made enough noise, someone, anyone, would believe her. Instead, the article barely gained traction. Without proof, without credibility, she was just another disgruntled former employee grasping at relevance. And then came the final blow. 2 weeks after her departure, Greg Stanton cut a deal with federal prosecutors. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he handed over everything. Karen's emails. Her authorizations. The offshore accounts where stolen money had been funneled. When the charges were officially filed, wire fraud, falsifying financial records, conspiracy to commit embezzlement, Karen's story didn't just crumble. It was erased. No one in the industry would touch her now. Ethan didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply moved forward. The real work wasn't in Karen's downfall, it was in ensuring that no one like her could ever rise again. Internal audits were overhauled. Compliance protocols were rewritten. Employee protections were strengthened so that no one would feel too afraid to speak up ever again. Karen's legacy wouldn't be one of destruction, it would be a warning. And as Ethan stood in his office, overlooking the city skyline, he knew one thing for certain. Karen Welch had spent her entire career believing she was untouchable. Now, she was nothing. But corruption like hers isn't always so easily exposed. How many other Karens are out there, hiding behind power, manipulating systems, and crushing those beneath them? Have you ever had to deal with one? Share your experience below, let's see who had it worse.